We have looked at the basic anatomy of the brain. We have looked at the structure of the neurons with the synapses, and that would be considered part of, you might want to say, like the electrical wiring of the brain. And now we're going to look at the chemical dimension of this marvelous system called the brain. The chemical system that we're most concerned with are neurotransmitters, and there are 6 of them that we are going to be looking at. It used to be thought that there were only a few neurotransmitters, and that has expanded into hundreds, and now there are even some who say into thousands. But the ones that we are concerned with primarily in mental health are 3 that are grouped together: serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And you should now start becoming very familiar with those abbreviations in the parentheses, because they will be used throughout all of your readings, throughout all of this course, and your career. These 3 together are called monoamines or monamines, and also catecholamines. Now there are several others. Acetylcholine stands kind of in a class by itself, and then glutamate and gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, are amino acid type proteins. And then we have a new category, or not new, but another category called peptide neurotransmitters, and especially substance P, which we will be looking at throughout this part of our lecture. I also keep encouraging you to go to the brain.mcgill.ca to explore this stuff in more depth. Let's look first at serotonin. It is important to also know in which area of the brain these chemicals, serotonin, norepinephrine, etc., are synthesized. So serotonin is produced in the brainstem in an area called the raphe nucleus, and its pathways, serotonin neurons, extend throughout the brain. Serotonin is the chemical that is largely implicated in our depressive and anxiety disorders, but it also has extremely important functions in blood clotting, in digestion, in sleep, much more than just our moods. Serotonin, depending upon whether it acts as an agonist or an antagonist at a receptor and which areas of the brain, has also effects on dopamine, increasing or decreasing the presence of dopamine. Our medications, most of the antidepressants involving serotonin, primarily block the reuptake into the presynaptic area so that there is more serotonin available in the synapse. There are also some serotonin medications that block the postsynaptic receptors, therefore increasing the presence of serotonin in the synapse by saying, don't shut off the supply. And then as we look at the psychiatric medications in the future for psychotic spectrum, we will find that also serotonin has antagonist and agonist actions at various different receptors. And those receptors, by the way, are classified into families, 5-HT, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and on. And then they are further classified into subtypes. So the 5-HT1 is broken down into A, B, and C. 5-HT2 is also broken down into A, B, and C. 3 isn't, and I'm not sure 4, 5, and 6, and 7 are. But one of the fascinating things is we think of these chemicals primarily in the brain, and they're neurons primarily in the brain, but there are actually more serotonin receptors in our gut than there are in the brain. And that's why when we talk about my gut didn't feel right, or I just had this gut sense, that serotonin probably is active. Again, there is a link here to scientificamerica.com that will talk to you a little bit more about serotonin in the gut. This might look a little daunting, and you certainly are not expected to memorize and know this, but I think it's interesting just to see it here and start tucking it away in our awareness that each of the serotonin families, receptors, is a little bit of a different type. And so you'll see that concept that we've talked about, G protein coupled, and further down under 5-HT3, you see it's a ligand gated, which is that either of sodium or potassium channel ions. And then You see the mechanism. It can either decrease or increase the levels of different chemicals and mechanisms. And finally, you see on the far right of this grid the potential that, depending upon where it is and what it does, it can be inhibitory or excitatory. This slide just gives you a nice visual picture that you see there in the brainstem, the area of the Rafe nucleus, and it is where serotonin is secreted or synthesized. And then it has serotonin neurons with receptors going all throughout the brain and even down into the central nervous system and then into the gut. However, serotonin, as you see, depending upon the activity, we've said it's primarily related to depression and anxiety, but also it's implicated in mood, obsessive compulsive disorders, in tics, and in schizophrenia. We'll be talking a lot about the psychotic disorder spectrum in 635, your second semesters of clinical. The next major neurotransmitter is dopamine, DA. It is produced primarily in the brainstem in the substantia nigra. It is also produced in the venter tegmentum area, and we'll see those on a slide in just a moment. Here it is, the receptors are divided into two families, D1 and D2, and then the D, each one has subgroups, as you can see here on the slide. In our work, it is the D2 receptors that are most implicated in our medications, especially the antipsychotics. And depending upon whether it's too much or too little, we can have psychosis, we can have Parkinson's disease. Too much dopamine in the nucleus accumbens results in addiction. Sex is involved with dopamine. When we have a good orgasm, dopamine is flooding through our brain, and dopamine is also extremely important for our attention, especially in the prefrontal cortex and in the nucleus accumbens. And then it is highly involved in our affect, moods, and mainly it is a positive influence in our moods. So as I said, most of the antipsychotic medications that we'll be looking at in the future involve dopamine levels, blocking dopamine primarily, the D2 receptors throughout the brain. Now, dopamine in the brain has four primary pathways, and we are going to look at that next. Those pathways are the mesostriatal, the mesolimbic, the mesocortical, and the tuberoinfundibular. Again, I encourage you to keep looking at the brain.miguel.ca. I hope you are viewing this PowerPoint using the slideshow format, so that in this slide you're actually going to be given a chance to identify the different areas of the brain. If you start at the upper, well, let's start at the lower, because that's where everything begins. So on the lower left is going to be the substantia nigra and the tegmentum area, and you see that in the brainstem. And then if you go up in toward the center, up toward the right, you're going to have the thalamus, and then beyond that is the striatum. And then if you go up beyond that would be the nucleus accumbens. So, and then if you go up to the right beyond that, you get into the prefrontal cortex, and there are two areas in there, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And then down in a little bit now down toward the left is the hypothalamus, and then beyond that toward the left and down at the bottom is the pituitary. So dopamine is formed or synthesized in the substantia nigra, and there is a pathway that goes up into the striatum and the nucleus accumbens, and that is the the mesostriatal pathway. Then there is another pathway that goes from the substantia nigra into the limbic area, and that is the mesolimbic pathway, including the amygdala and the hippocampus and the hypothalamus. Then there is another pathway that goes up into the prefrontal cortex, both into the dorsolateral and into the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and these pathways are involved in the processes of thinking and attention focusing, and also in the valence or the weight that we give to our emotions. And then there is the little pathway called the tuberoinfundibular pathway, and that is from the anterior pituitary. If dopamine is blocked there, it is going to stimulate the presence of prolactin, which is going to stimulate then two different side effects to our medications. If dopamine is blocked by our medications, there will be two primary side effects if that tuberoinfundibular pathway is activated, and that would be gynomastia, where gentlemen develop breast enlargement, or gynochoria if women are lactating when they are not pregnant. Galactorrhea, not gynochoria, galactorrhea. All of the neurotransmitters have pathways extending from where the neurotransmitter is synthesized all throughout the brain, and dopamine is no exception. So here you can see dopamine from the brainstem going up into all areas. The mesolimbic would be going into the hypothalamus, into the amygdala, and into the hippocampus there in the center lower area. It is also going the mesostriatal pathway up in toward the left center of the brain with the striatal area and the nucleus accumbens. It goes through the basal forebrain and up into the prefrontal cortex, as we have said, both the dorsolateral and the ventral medial. Then you can't see it in this slide, but there is also that little tuberoinfundibular pathway, which would be somewhere around the hypothalamus. And then Stahl also mentions a fifth pathway, the mesothalamic pathway, which is not necessarily one that we are going to be dealing with that much in our medications, but it may be involved in both arousal and sleep. Here's another slide that allows you to see this a little bit more clearly. We have numbered here. Number 1 is the nigrostriatal pathway. You see it going up into the striatum, is also called the basal ganglia, and around the basal ganglia in this pathway is also the nucleus accumbens. So this is an area, if dopamine is blocked in this area, there might be motor effects of the side effects of our medications, and dopamine blockage, insufficient dopamine in this area is what causes Parkinsonism. But if there is not enough, or if there is too much dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, not enough, we can't pay attention and filter out distracting signals. Too much, and we are flooded and have problems with addiction. The second pathway is the mesolimbic pathway, and that is going into the amygdala and the hippocampus, and that is part of our alarming system. And if there is too much dopamine in the amygdala, that can lead to our psychosis with hallucinations and aggressive behavior. Then number 3 is the mesocortical pathway, those projections going up into the dorsolateral and the ventral medial prefrontal cortexes. With those is involved our ability to pay attention, to sustain attention, to think clearly, and to plan. And then number 4 is that tiny little one that I mentioned several slides back, the tuberoinfundibular, that if there is problems there, it leads to galactorrhea and gynomastia. Now let's talk about the third neurotransmitter in the monoamine or catecholamine group. Along with serotonin and dopamine, we have norepinephrine. It is produced in the locus coeruleus of the brainstem. Again, it has projections, as we'll see in the next slide, all throughout the brain. But norepinephrine is what is involved in the fight, flight, and also freeze of our sympathetic nervous system. It is very important for mood Too much norepinephrine, though, and can result in mania, and not enough norepinephrine is associated with depression and with problems of inattention, not being able to pay attention. Some of our supposedly newer medications, besides blocking serotonin, also at the same time block the reuptake of norepinephrine. And three of those are Effexor, which is now venlafaxine generic, Pristiq, which has not gone generic yet, I don't think, and Cymbalta, which is also called duloxetine. And then in the past 2 or 3 years, we've had several other medications come on the market that are also norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors with yet other modalities involved. And those two are Vibrid, called Vilacidone generically, and vortioxetine, which initially was called Brintellix, but the name has been changed now to Trintellix because there were confusions with a different medication on the market in terms of the brand name. Here's an artistic representation of the cholecatamine norepinephrine pathways throughout the brain. And there you see down in the brainstem, the locus coeruleus, and then actually the name locus coeruleus in Latin means the blue space, so I think it's the artistic representation here has even put the locus coeruleus in blue, and you see the pathways projecting throughout the brain. Now, we often say that we feel pumped with adrenaline, and that may be the case, but the norepinephrine is a noradrenergic, and so it is hooked into the adrenaline system, and therefore too much norepinephrine is when we can really feel overexcited, pumped up, and too much excess is related to mania. We've been talking about these neurotransmitters separately. However, we should not think of them as separate and distinct. They also interact and overlap in how they affect us and the way they interact and influence the presence of each other in our brains. And so, as you can see, there are certain qualities that are associated uniquely with each different catecholamine or monoamine neurotransmitter. So norepinephrine has uniqueness for alertness, concentration, and energy, supposedly, and serotonin on the right is more involved in obsessions, compulsions, and somewhat in memory, and dopamine is definitely involved in pleasure and reward and motivation and drive, but you can see that they also have overlapping functions. I may have mentioned before that these blue slides come out of Stephen Stahl's text that we will be using throughout the 3 clinical courses, 634, 5, and 6. And so some of these slides will be repeated throughout several of your classes. And this slide is actually going to show up again in topic 6 of 634 when we talk about depression. But I like this slide because it shows what happens when there is not enough or a dysfunction in the various neurotransmitters. We talk about having a positive affect, and that would be feeling joyfulness and happiness, being interested in things and taking pleasure in things, having energy and enthusiasm, being alert and self-confident. Now, if those are reduced, that's reduced positive affect, that can be because there is a dysfunction in the dopamine system or in the norepinephrine system. And you can see there the little brain maps with the blue dotted from the projections from the brainstem throughout the brain. Then on the right-hand side, you see that if there are negative affect associated with the different mood disorders where we feel depressed and guilt and disgust and fearful and anxious and hostile and irritable and lonely. And this is increased negative affect. And this can happen also if there is a decrease in or malfunction in the serotonergic serotonin pathways and the noradrenergic or norepinephrine pathways. So when things are all well balanced, that's when in the moodometer, right there in the middle, it's normal mood. We come now to a different type of neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, and we said that norepinephrine is involved in the sympathetic nervous system, while acetylcholine is primarily involved in the parasympathetic nervous system. So it is what brings us back down after we have been shot up into the air through our sympathetic nervous system, getting us out of danger. The sympathetic nervous system activated by acetylcholine parachutes us back down to earth where we rest and digest. Acetylcholine is also involved in memory, and so it is the neurotransmitter that is implicated in Alzheimer's disease, and our Alzheimer medications or cognitive enhancers work by inhibiting the action of acetylcholine esterase, the enzyme that degrades acetylcholine. And so if we inhibit acetylcholine esterase, we are going to increase the levels of acetylcholine. Anytime you inhibit the enzyme that breaks down the neurotransmitter, you are increasing the presence of the neurotransmitter. So acetylcholine is a cholinergic, stimulating the release of acetylcholine. And when that happens, we are able to rest and digest. And so we are able to salivate, lacrimate, urinate, and defecate, or in the vernacular, spit, cry, pee, and poop. And we all know the effects of this. For instance, when we are involved in something that is a crisis or an emergency, our mouths dry up and we do not even think about going to the bathroom. But then when it's over, all of a sudden, oh my God, I gotta pee, or all of a sudden we'll break down in tears. That is the effect of acetylcholine coming back online. Here is the artistic representation of acetylcholine pathways throughout the brain. It is formed in a midbrain nucleus, but also you'll see down there on the bottom left an area called the basal forebrain nuclei, and in there is an area called the basalis of Minart, whatever that is, and that is where acetylcholine is synthesized. Acetylcholine is also involved in our wake-sleep cycles. It is thought to play a great role in memory, and we'll be talking about that much more when we look at Alzheimer's disorders in MSN 635. All right, we have looked at acetylcholine formed in the basalis of Minart in the basal forebrain. It is involved in memory functions, it's involved in movement functions, it's involved in wake-sleep functions. It is the primary neurotransmitter in our parasympathetic nervous system. We have looked at the catecholamines. We started with serotonin, 5-HT, which is involved very much in mood disorders and is the object of our antidepressant medications. It is also involved when we talk about it having antagonist and agonist actions. It's involved in our antipsychotic medications. Then we have dopamine, which is involved in, if there's an excess of dopamine, we can lead to hallucinations and addictions. If there is a deficiency of dopamine, we can have inattention, we can have movement disorders, and then there is norepinephrine. An excess of this leads to manias. We feel pumped on adrenaline, and a insufficiency of it, especially in the prefrontal cortex, leads to inattentive symptoms. Okay, we have a few more important neurotransmitters yet to cover as we're talking about the chemical system of the brain. In neurobiology, glutamate. Glutamate has the reputation of being the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. If you want to think of it in terms of an image, think of it as the gas pedal of the nervous system. It is excitatory. Like the other neurotransmitters, its pathways are found throughout the brain. It is very much involved in the cortical areas in terms of memory, and in the hippocampal area in terms of memory and our cognitive functions. And too much glutamate, being excitatory, can actually lead to what's called exocyticity, toxicity. Too much excitation, it becomes toxic, and this is one of the things that is being looked at in Alzheimer's disorder. Also, too much glutamate can feel like to the brain an inflammation, and this is being studied now with implications for depression. Especially, you may have seen in the news recently, ketamine, which is a veterinarian anesthetic, can be used, is being used in very carefully controlled research settings to treat depression. So it is also involved in our motor functions, and the glutamate neurons actually look like their soma look like little pyramids, and so this glutamate, the pyramidal system, is the glutamate system of neurons, and outside that is called the extrapyramidal system, which we will see when we talk about the side effects to some of our antipsychotic medications. So glutamate is also involved in balance and the other cerebellar functions and in our sensory functions. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter that is implicated in both Alzheimer's disorder and in alcohol problems. Like the other neurotransmitters, glutamate has various receptors throughout the brain. They are classified into two primary groups, ion receptors and metabotropic receptors. You are not going to need to memorize too much of this, please, but I want to draw your attention to the left-hand side here under the ion type receptors of the ionotropic. The first two there, the NMDA, which stands for N-methyl D-aspartate ion receptors. These do figure largely in our work, and this receptor is now implicated in depression, schizophrenia, and Alzheimer's disease. By blocking it, we may improve memory or at least retard the advance of Alzheimer's. By blocking it, we may improve symptoms of schizophrenia. By blocking the NMDA receptor, we may improve depression, and that's where that novel treatment for ketamine works on this receptor, the NMDA. And then to a lesser extent, the one to the right, the AMPA, is also a receptor that figures into some of our medications. The far right, the metabotropic, I can't tell you too much about them because I haven't seen much in studying our medications. Okay, we're coming down to the finish line here. The second of the amino acid neurotransmitters is GABA, aminobutyric acid. Thank God they call it GABA, right? Just as we said that glutamate is the universal excitatory neurotransmitter, GABA is known as the universal inhibitory, therefore we could call it the brake pedal. And there are two primary families of receptors, GABA A and B, which we'll be looking at in topic 7 of 634 as we talk about anxiety disorders. It is obviously then GABA is important in the treatment of anxiety. It is also important for the treatment of alcohol withdrawal because alcohol suppresses, initially stimulates GABA and then suppresses it with an influx of glutamate, and so GABA will then calm down the effects of glutamate, which leads to the convulsions. Now, there's also the possibility if someone has been on a GABA enhancing medication for anxiety at high doses for a long period of time, it's like they have been applying the brake pedal at full steam with full force, and then if GABA medications, GABA enhancing medications, are withdrawn suddenly, it is like you take your foot off the brake and you slam your foot on the gas pedal, and you get an influx, a flood of glutamate, and that can lead to exotoxicity, which are also known as convulsions. These drugs involving GABA, because they are so pleasurable, they chill you out, they make you not care, they have a very high addictive potential. I invite you again, please keep checking out thebrain.mcgill.ca. And finally, we come to the last of the type of neurotransmitters that are involved in most of our work in psych and mental health, the peptide neurotransmitters, one of the newest areas of research. And I really can't tell you too much more beyond that it is just a new area of research. There are opioid type peptides, there are hormone releasing peptides, and there is something called a substance P, which is involved in pain transmission. There's exciting type of work taking place around these peptides, because if an opioid type peptide can be discovered, endorphins and enkephalins that we can enhance, rather than using the opioid medications that have such a high addictive possibility, we may be able to cut down on the problems of pain while at the same time not causing the problems of addiction. Hormone releasing peptides, there is one in particular, the CRF, the cortico-releasing hormone, which releases cortisol into the body, and high levels of cortisol are inflammatory. They stop or cause insulin resistance, and so they're looking at this as a way of possibly, if we can find something that would work on these hormone releasing peptides, we'd be able to help people with anxiety issues and depression issues, and then substance P obviously would be involved in pain management. You can put a lot of this together, again, if you will go to thebrain.mcgill.ca. So we have looked at the anatomical structure of the brain, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we have looked at the electrical system of the brain with the neurons and the exocytosis of letting a neurotransmitter into the synapse. And now we are looking, we've also looked now at the chemical. So this whole thing starts with an initial event, a first messenger system that can take place in milliseconds, but then it starts long-term consequences, second messenger systems that can take hours to days and can last days to years. There are two main types of receptors that we've looked at, the G protein linked systems, which are called metabotrophic or slow, and remember that picture of the little like whale coming up and hooking into that looked like a little golf tee, and then that would link into an enzyme. And then we have the ion channel link systems, ionotropic, which are much faster acting. We have some hormone link systems, but all of this downstream, the signal transduction cascades, passing from an extracellular first messenger into an intracellular second, third, and fourth messenger system. All of this is leading to gene expression, and one of the most important things is the production of brain-derived neurotropic factor, BDNF, which fortifies and strengthens and makes more robust the whole electrical system or wiring system of the brain to therefore have a more healthy nervous system. Those of you who want to do a little bit more testing of yourselves, please avail yourself of Quizlet through the next slide, where you will be forced to both remember and retrieve information, therefore promoting greater learning.